There's a quiet moment most men feel but can't explain. You sense something is there. Warmth, curiosity, maybe even attachment, but on the surface, all you meet is distance, confidence, or a carefully controlled calm. It creates unease, because when emotions are obvious, they're easy to respond to, but when they're hidden behind pride, they leave you questioning your own perception. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why that confusion isn't accidental, and why recognizing it can change how you see her and yourself. If you value thoughtful conversations about relationships and personal growth, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Not because you need more noise in your life, but because clarity deserves a place to return to. Now let's talk about ego. In psychology, ego isn't arrogance, it's protection. It's the part of us that says, I won't expose what could be rejected. For many women, especially emotionally intelligent ones, the ego becomes a shield, not to manipulate, but to stay safe. When feelings start to form for a man who matters, vulnerability suddenly feels risky. And so, ego steps in quietly, disguising emotion as composure. One of the first things men misunderstand is assuming that strong feelings always show up as pursuit. In reality, when a woman feels deeply but doesn't feel fully secure, emotionally or situationally, she often does the opposite. She tightens control. She appears self-contained. She seems unaffected. This isn't disinterest, it's emotional self-regulation under pressure. You might notice that when conversations get slightly more personal, she subtly redirects them. Not because she doesn't care, but because caring too much would mean revealing something she's not ready to own out loud. Ego doesn't deny feelings. It delays their exposure. Another subtle clue appears in how she manages emotional balance around you. She may be warm one moment and neutral the next. This inconsistency isn't emotional instability, it's internal negotiation. Part of her wants closeness, another part insists on maintaining dignity and independence. Ego mediates that conflict by allowing just enough connection to feel alive, while preventing full emotional surrender. Pay attention to how she reacts to your absence. Not dramatically, not with protest, but with a slight shift. Maybe she becomes more composed, more formal, less expressive. That's not indifference, that's containment. When ego masks feelings, it often tightens during moments where longing might otherwise surface. What matters most here is not decoding her, but understanding the emotional environment this creates for you. When you're around someone whose ego is guarding unspoken feelings, you can start to feel uncertain, off balance, or even subtly tested. That's because you're interacting with two layers, what she shows and what she's holding back. This is where many men make mistakes. They push for clarity too quickly, or they withdraw out of frustration. Both responses ignore the emotional truth underneath. Ego masks feelings most when they feel real and fragile. Understanding this isn't about control, it's about emotional literacy. When you learn to recognize when ego is present, you stop taking distance personally. You stop reacting impulsively, and you begin responding with steadiness, the one quality that quietly lowers emotional defenses without force. And that, whether you realize it or not, is where real connection begins. The second subtle sign appears in how she listens to you, especially when you talk about your values, struggles, or ambitions. When a woman's ego is masking her true feelings, she listens with unusual intensity, but she rarely reveals how deeply your words land. You may notice she remembers small details weeks later, things you assumed passed unnoticed. That memory isn't accidental. Emotional investment sharpens attention. Ego simply keeps the reaction restrained. From a psychological perspective, we remember what matters to us emotionally. When her ego is active, she doesn't announce that something matters. She archives it quietly. This is why she might surprise you by recalling something deeply personal you shared casually. It's not strategy, it's attachment operating silently beneath self-control. Another layer of this sign shows up in how she responds to emotional vulnerability. If you open up slightly, without dramatizing, without demanding reassurance, she may not immediately mirror your vulnerability. Instead, she grounds the moment. She may offer calm perspective, practical support, or quiet presence. On the surface, this can feel emotionally distant, but internally, it often signals respect. respect and care. Ego prefers stability over exposure. It supports without revealing how much is at stake. You might also notice that she rarely speaks negatively about you, even when she could. When ego masks feelings, criticism feels dangerous, not because you're fragile, but because damaging the connection would hurt her more than she's willing to admit. So instead, she stays measured. She chooses neutrality over confrontation, silence over accusation. This restraint isn't emotional coldness, it's emotional preservation. A particularly misunderstood behavior appears when other people enter the picture. If she senses competition, another woman's interest in you, she may not react outwardly at all. No jealousy, no claims, no visible discomfort. But internally, ego tightens its grip. Rather than expressing fear of loss, she doubles down on self-composure. This can confuse men because they expect desire to announce itself through reaction. But for many emotionally aware women, ego forbids visible insecurity. Here's the critical insight most men miss. When ego is present, she is watching how you handle power without claiming it. She observes whether you remain grounded without reassurance, respectful without distance, confident without pressure. Ego doesn't test to manipulate, it tests to evaluate safety. And safety, emotionally, isn't built through persuasion. It's built through consistency. When she senses that you don't need emotional confirmation to stay centered, something important shifts. Her ego no longer needs to work as hard. Guarding becomes exhausting when there is no threat. This is why pushing for emotional clarity often backfires. When you demand verbal confirmation from someone whose ego is active, you force a choice between vulnerability and self-respect. Ego will always choose self-respect. Silence wins, distance increases, not because she doesn't feel, but because she refuses to feel exposed. The men who navigate this well don't chase signs. They don't interrogate emotions. They stay emotionally available without urgency, present without pressure, clear without force. This posture doesn't break ego, it relaxes it. And when ego relaxes, what replaces it isn't drama or confession. It's something quieter, more honest, and far more revealing than words. The third subtle sign emerges in moments of emotional contrast, specifically how she behaves when she feels seen versus when she feels observed. When a woman's ego is masking her true feelings, she becomes more expressive in environments where there is no pressure to perform emotionally. This might happen during light, unexpected conversations, shared humor, or moments that feel private even when others are around. In those moments, her guard softens, not completely, but enough to reveal something genuine. You may notice her laughter changes. It becomes less controlled, more spontaneous. Her eye contact lingers slightly longer. Her presence feels warmer, more relaxed. These shifts aren't conscious signals. They're emotional leaks. Ego is strongest under evaluation and weakest when attention feels safe rather than demanding. Psychologically, this happens because ego requires energy. It's effortful. When she feels no risk of emotional exposure, that effort relaxes and her natural emotional responses emerge. This is why men sometimes feel confused. She seems open one day, distant the next. The difference isn't interest, it's perceived safety. Another part of this sign shows up in how she reacts to your emotional steadiness. When you remain calm during uncertainty, when you don't overinterpret silence or push for reassurance, she notices. She may not comment on it, but internally, it registers as emotional maturity. Ego respects restraint. It opens gradually in the presence of someone who doesn't demand access. You might also sense that she seeks subtle alignment rather than overt closeness. She mirrors your language patterns. She adopts similar values in conversation. She becomes curious about things that matter to you, not dramatically but consistently. This isn't coincidence. Emotional investment naturally pulls us toward alignment. Ego simply prevents the admission of why that alignment matters. Another overlooked behavior is how she handles moments of misunderstanding. If there's tension or mild emotional friction, she may choose reflection over reaction. She might pull back briefly, not to punish or manipulate, but to regain internal balance. Ego steps in to prevent emotional impulsivity. For men unfamiliar with this dynamic, that pause can feel like rejection. In reality, it's regulation. What's important here is how you respond to these pauses. If you fill them with anxiety, pressure, or over-explanation, you reinforce the need for ego. If you allow space without withdrawal, remaining kind, consistent, and self-respecting, you send a powerful message. Connection doesn't require emotional control. This is where emotional polarity quietly forms, not dominance, not submission, but grounded presence meeting guarded feeling. The balance matters. When you hold your center without needing hers to validate it, you become emotionally predictable in the best way. Safe doesn't mean boring. Safe means reliable under emotional weight. Over time, ego grows tired of defending against someone who isn't attacking. The need to mask fades when there's no threat of emotional exploitation or instability, and when that happens, expression becomes simpler, less calculated, more real. The mistake many men make is trying to earn emotional openness. Openness isn't earned, it's allowed. And it's allowed when ego no longer believes it must protect something fragile. Understanding this shifts the entire dynamic. You stop chasing emotional moments and start becoming someone whose presence makes ego unnecessary. The fourth subtle sign appears in how she asserts independence around you. When a woman's ego is masking her true feelings, she often emphasizes self-sufficiency, not loudly, not defensively, but consistently. She may mention how busy she is, how capable she is on her own, how full her life already feels. On the surface, this can sound like a boundary or even a warning. Psychologically, it's something else entirely. Independence becomes more visible when attachment begins to form. Why? Because attachment creates internal vulnerability, and ego responds by reinforcing identity. It says, "I am whole without needing anyone." Not to push you away, but to remind herself that closeness doesn't mean losing control. You might notice she avoids asking for help, even when it would be reasonable to do so, or she downplays moments where your support mattered. This isn't rejection of you, it's protection of self-image. Accepting help can feel like admitting emotional reliance. When ego is active, reliance feels risky. Another aspect of this sign shows up in decision-making. She may make choices without consulting you, even in situations where collaboration would feel natural. Not because she doesn't value your input, but because involving you emotionally acknowledges significance. Ego delays that acknowledgement until safety feels certain. There's also a subtle emotional paradox here. While she asserts independence, she becomes more responsive to respect. Not flattery, not pursuit, respect. When you honor her autonomy without withdrawing warmth, something important happens internally. Ego feels validated rather than threatened. And when ego feels respected, it doesn't need to perform as strongly. Men often misread this independence as emotional unavailability and respond by either pulling away or escalating effort. Both reactions misunderstand the moment. Pulling away confirms emotional distance. Escalating effort triggers ego defense. The middle path, steady presence without intrusion, is what softens the dynamic. You may also notice that when she talks about her future, she speaks in singular terms. I plan, I want, I'm focused. This doesn't mean you aren't part of her emotional landscape. It means ego is maintaining psychological boundaries while feelings are still integrating. Future language shifts only after internal certainty forms. What matters here is not whether she needs you, but whether she feels safe wanting you. Need threatens ego, want doesn't. When you show that you are an addition to her life, not a solution to a problem, you remove pressure. Ego doesn't have to defend against loss of self. This is why emotional maturity in men is so quietly powerful. When you don't position yourself as necessary, you become chosen. When you don't compete with her independence, you complement it. And over time, when ego sees that closeness doesn't require surrendering identity, it loosens. Independence stops being a shield and becomes a shared strength. That's when emotional honesty begins to feel like expansion rather than risk. The fifth subtle sign shows itself in how she manages emotional timing. When a woman's ego is masking her true feelings, she becomes highly selective about when she engages emotionally, not whether she does. You may notice she opens up in controlled moments, often when circumstances feel contained or when there's a natural ending to the interaction. This isn't coincidence, it's emotional regulation. Psychologically, Ego prefers predictability. If emotions surface in moments that feel open-ended, they can spiral into vulnerability. So instead, she chooses windows where expression feels safe, short conversations, late messages that don't invite immediate response, brief moments of honesty followed by composure. It's not inconsistency, it's containment. You might experience this as mixed signals. One moment, she shares something meaningful. The next, she returns to neutrality. This isn't withdrawal, it's recovery. Emotional exposure, even small, requires recalibration when ego is involved. She steps back to regain internal balance. Another element of this sign appears in how she reacts to emotional depth initiated by you. If you push slightly too fast into emotional territory, asking direct questions about feelings or the connection, she may redirect with humor, logic, or surface-level topics, not because she lacks depth, but because ego hasn't approved the timing. Depth without emotional readiness feels unsafe. What's important is how she responds when emotional moments arise naturally, when something meaningful happens organically, a shared realization, a moment of mutual understanding. You may see her soften briefly without resistance. Those moments matter. They reveal that emotion isn't absent, it's curated. Ego-driven timing also affects conflict. If tension arises, she may delay addressing it, not to avoid resolution, but to avoid impulsive vulnerability. She wants to respond from clarity, not emotion. This can be misread as emotional distance, but it's often emotional responsibility. Men who struggle here tend to interpret delayed emotional engagement as lack of interest and react with either pressure or retreat. Both disrupt emotional rhythm. Pressure triggers defense. Retreat signals instability. Neither helps ego relax. The men who navigate this well respect emotional pacing. They allow conversations to unfold without demanding immediacy. They understand that emotional trust builds through repeated experiences of safety, not through accelerated intimacy. There's a quiet confidence in allowing space without creating distance, in remaining warm without pushing, in being emotionally available without urgency. That posture communicates something powerful. I'm not afraid of your feelings, and I don't need to control them. When ego senses this, timing becomes less guarded. Emotional windows widen naturally. Conversations deepen without force. Expression becomes more fluid. The deeper truth is this: when a woman's ego masks her feelings, it's because those feelings matter. Indifference doesn't require timing. Care does. And when you respect emotional timing, you don't lose momentum, you build trust. And trust, slowly and quietly, is what convinces ego that it can finally step aside. Another sign becomes visible in how she protects emotional tone rather than emotional distance. When a woman's ego is masking her true feelings, she is less focused on avoiding you and more focused on avoiding emotional intensity that might expose her inner state. So instead of pulling away completely, she manages how interactions feel. You may notice she keeps conversations balanced, never too deep, never too detached. She steers away from emotional extremes. This isn't boredom, it's emotional self-control. Ego isn't trying to eliminate connection, it's trying to regulate it. This often shows up as emotional steadiness that feels almost too composed. She rarely overreacts, rarely overshares, rarely lets moments spiral. For some men, this calmness can feel like lack of passion, but psychologically, it often signals the opposite: passion that's being managed carefully. Another subtle behavior appears when emotional closeness begins to feel obvious. She may lightly change the tone, introducing humor, practicality, or casual conversation to prevent the moment from becoming emotionally defining. Ego resists moments that force internal truth into external acknowledgement. Pay attention to how she handles emotional praise. When you recognize her qualities, not appearance, but character or emotional depth, she may deflect or minimize it, not because she doesn't appreciate it, but because accepting it makes her feel seen. And being seen emotionally requires lowering defenses. What's important here is that she still shows up. She doesn't disappear, she maintains connection. That's the difference between emotional avoidance and emotional masking. Avoidance creates distance. Masking preserves proximity while managing exposure. This is also why emotional consistency from you matters so much. When your tone remains grounded regardless of hers, when you don't escalate or withdraw based on emotional shifts, you become emotionally predictable, and predictability lowers the need for control. Men often believe intensity creates attraction. In reality, emotional reliability creates safety, and safety is what allows ego to rest. When she senses that emotional closeness won't overwhelm the dynamic, she gradually allows moments to linger longer. She doesn't redirect as quickly. She doesn't reset the tone as often. These changes are subtle, but meaningful. This stage isn't about action. It's about patience. Ego isn't convinced by words. It's convinced by patterns. And when patterns show stability, respect, and emotional self-possession, masking becomes unnecessary. The connection deepens, not through pursuit, but through emotional steadiness that invites openness without demand. And that brings us to the final understanding most men never hear, one that changes how you interpret everything you've experienced so far. The final truth is this: when a woman's ego masks her true feelings, the most revealing sign isn't something she does, it's something that slowly stops happening. The tension fades, the guardedness softens, the emotional management becomes less necessary, and it happens not because she decided to trust, but because she no longer feels the need to protect. At this stage, you may notice that she becomes simpler around you, not dramatic, not suddenly expressive, just real. Conversations feel less filtered, silences feel comfortable rather than heavy. There's less emotional calculation. Ego steps back when it no longer senses emotional risk. This is where many men finally realize something important. Her ego was never the obstacle, it was the bridge. It existed to carry her safely toward clarity. And clarity doesn't arrive through pressure, it arrives through consistency. You see, ego masks feelings most when the stakes are high and the outcome feels uncertain. When a woman isn't sure how her emotions will be handled, she manages them carefully. But when she experiences repeated moments of emotional safety, being respected without being chased, valued without being claimed, met without being controlled, her internal environment changes. She no longer needs to prove independence. She no longer needs to regulate timing so tightly. She no longer needs to manage tone, not because she has surrendered power, but because she trusts the dynamic. And here's the part most men were never taught. You don't create this by doing more. You create it by being stable, by not reacting emotionally to emotional complexity, by not demanding certainty before it naturally forms, by allowing her emotional process to unfold without interruption. This doesn't mean waiting endlessly. It means staying self-respecting, grounded, clear about who you are and how you show up. Ego relaxes around men who are internally settled, men who don't need emotional outcomes to validate their worth. When ego steps aside, feelings don't explode into confession. They integrate quietly. She becomes more present, more open, more naturally expressive. Not because she decided to reveal herself, but because she feels safe being known. If there's one thing to take from this, it's this. Emotional maturity isn't about decoding behavior. It's about becoming someone whose presence makes decoding unnecessary. And when you do that, you stop chasing signs. You stop questioning every shift. You stop trying to read between lines, because the connection finally begins to speak for itself. If this perspective helped you understand women and yourself on a deeper level, stay connected. These conversations are about growth, not games. And clarity, when it's earned, is always worth the patience it requires.